As you learned in the previous module, biopsychologists conduct their research in a variety of fundamentally different ways. To get a clearer sense of biopsychology and its diversity, we'll be describing the 6 major divisions of biopsychology. In Module 1.3, we looked at various disciplines of neuroscience, one of them being biopsychology. This module will look at 6 major divisions of biopsychology. Now, each of these may sound familiar and may sound very similar to the disciplines we discussed in 1.3. However, please note that these divisions are subdivisions of biopsychology alone, whereas in 1.3, biopsychology is a discipline itself contributing to neuroscience. In other words, these major divisions contribute to the understanding of biopsychology only, and then biopsychology then takes it a step further to contribute to neuroscience. Although each division has a different approach, please note that there is significant overlap, and sometimes this can be a bit tricky to understand, especially as we look at psychophysiology and physiological psychology. So please take good notes as we go over each of these 6 major divisions of biopsychology. Physiological psychology is a division that studies the neural mechanisms of behavior. More specifically, they examine the physiological mechanisms that lead to psychological activity. For example, they'd be interested in understanding what specific parts of our body influence our mental processes. Contrary to conventional belief, of romantic conventional belief of being in love because our heart is involved with that, people in the physiological psychology field would be interested in looking at the brain activity that makes individuals feel in love or perceive that they're in love. Because this is a rather intricate study, this typically requires direct manipulation of the brain in controlled experiments. This sometimes requires invasive processes, such as the implanting of electrodes, which are electrical devices that are implanted in a specific part of the brain to see what effect, if any, that has on behavior. The subjects are usually laboratory animals, as it is easier to work with them for reasons stated in Module 1.4. Please also note that this specific division has a strong focus on pure research, as often the knowledge that would be acquired would not be known until thereafter, and sometimes not even at the completion of the study, but once this is published, if it is published, then another scientist who would then be interested in applied research would be able to make sense and use of the information gathered from this study. Psychopharmacology is similar to physiological psychology in the sense that it focuses on manipulation of neural activity and behavior, but in this case specifically with drugs. Some people consider this a bit less invasive, as the testing would not require any surgeries. In this case, we would use drugs. For example, SSRIs, you may remember that this is an antidepressant that functions by inhibiting the reuptake of selective serotonin levels in our brain. And as we look at the psychopharmacology, it typically develops drugs for the purpose of helping individuals. However, although drugs are sometimes used by psychopharmacologists to study the basic principles of brain behavior interaction, please remember that the purpose of many psychopharmacological experiments is to develop therapeutic drugs or to reduce drug abuse. They use substantial proportion of applied research, which is a bit different than the previous division stated, and as we will look through other disciplines, you will see how there is a significant overlap between them all. Neuropsychology is one of the subdisciplines of biopsychology that studies psychological effects of brain damage in human patients, but not through experimentation. And the reason why is because it would be unethical to infer some type of injury on humans. Instead, what it does is make use of individuals who may have sustained injuries already. For example, Phineas Gage, a very popular case you may have heard about in your general psychology course, was an American railroad construction foreman that's remembered for his survival of an accident that was shocking to see that he would still be alive. A metal rod went right through his skull, damaging specifically the frontal lobe on the left side. Interestingly, his behavior was changed, but perhaps even more importantly in here is that he survived. However, sources say that prior to the accident, Phineas Gage was a different man, more responsible, more of a family man that would provide for his family. And after his recovery, he and his behavior was just different. He was no longer a responsible man and often struggled to maintain a job. This focus on the brain and based on injuries led us to believe that in the frontal lobe there are no functions of survival. And so damaging the brain and that specific part may allow us to remain alive for the most part. However, as we looked at his behavior, we brought into account whether this specific part is responsible for personality components, perhaps personality traits, perhaps for decision making, which today we have certainty of that this is the case. Please note that neuropsychology has focused on cerebral cortex the most, and the reason why is because it is easier to work with the cerebral cortex as it is the outer layer of the cerebral hemispheres. If we start tapping into the brainstem, we start looking at parts of the brain that are responsible for breathing and heartbeat and other vital functions. Also, the cerebral cortex is most likely to be damaged by accidents or injuries, as again, it is the outermost layer of the cerebral hemispheres. And also, one more thing you need to know is that this is the most applied of all biopsychological subdisciplines, meaning that the research that's done in neuropsychology typically is because of an expected goal, unlike pure research where we may not know what the results would be. Psychophysiology is the subdiscipline of biopsychology that studies the relation between physiological activity and psychological processes in human subjects. This is not to be confused with physiological psychology, which focuses on the physiological mechanisms that lead to psychological activity. This subdiscipline, psychophysiology that is, examines the way psychological activities lead to physiological responses. For example, do your thoughts have an effect on your behavior and the way your body functions? As we look at our mental processes, we seek to understand how it is that our body changes. When individuals win or when they're cheering for a team, say the Dodgers, and they win, the Dodger fans typically their body becomes larger. You may have seen at a stadium that whenever the team scores, individuals who root for that team raise their hands up in a victorious fashion, which demonstrates that they feel competent and they want to demonstrate it to the world. Well, that may seem like a just general behavior. We also see that individuals who would have lost and fans of the team that was scored on typically become smaller. And instead of using their and putting their hands up, sometimes they cover their face or they slouch back on their chair, also appearing to be some type of physiological activity. And so this would be of interest to anyone in psychophysiology, as they would look at the emotions that would have been felt because of psychological activities. Please note that the methods used to investigate this are typically non-invasive, so commonly electroencephalograms and measures of eye movement, muscle tension, and other indicators of autonomic nervous system activity are used. For example, heart rate, blood pressure, pupil dilation, and even electrical conductance of the skin are assessed to see if any changes are occurring in the individual. An example that was used and that your textbook provides is how individuals who have been diagnosed with schizophrenia have often difficulty smoothly tracking a moving object as a pendulum. You can see through our example here on the slide that at the very top, the C component here, this is an individual who has not been diagnosed with schizophrenia, and when asked to track a pendulum that's swinging in front of him from left to right, you could see how smooth the tracking appears. However, as you look at individuals with schizophrenia, underneath we have three different individuals that all have been diagnosed with schizophrenia, and notice how broken the pattern is. This, we believe, is because of the constant interruptions that are occurring in their brain, as these individuals sometimes experience hallucinations, both visual and auditory, and this would likely distract them from whatever is in front of them, therefore not allowing for a smooth tracking of the moving object. Cognitive neuroscience is the newest division of biopsychology, and this naturally focuses on studying the neural basis of cognition. As you may remember, cognition for your general psych class, it is a term that generally refers to higher intellectual processes such as thought, memory, language, attention, or any other complex perceptual processes. This subdiscipline also uses non-invasive methods, typically brain scanning techniques that allow us to analyze the brain as it engages in a particular task. This does not require any penetration or surgeries of the brain, and often involves collaborations between researchers with widely different backgrounds, such as biopsychology, cognitive psychology, economists, computer scientists, and many others. In Chapter 5, we will look a little bit further into functional brain imaging, but for now, I want you to know that these are brain scanning techniques that record images of the activity of a brain while an individual is engaging in a particular cognitive activity. For example, if I tell you I have a surprise for you and I have you hooked up to a brain imaging scanner and then I give you a chocolate, we can actually see the neural basis of cognition and the brain activity that would be taking place in your brain while you are receiving the chocolate and while you're engaging in eating the chocolate, and even thereafter, how long it would take you to get back down to your baseline. However, we can also see that other parts of your brain would have been activated had I placed, instead of a chocolate in your hand, a cockroach or anything that was not so pleasant. We would then see brain activity that would be different than what a chocolate would stimulate. And so as we go through this process, we understand that the thought processes, the emotions, and all these higher complex activities in the brain can be studied by cognitive neuroscience. The last of the disciplines is the comparative psychology. Although most biopsychologists study the neural mechanisms of behavior, there is more to biopsychology than this. This particular subfield deals with the biology of behavior, more specifically with the DNA, with the genes, with your chromosomes, rather than specifically with neural mechanisms of behavior. In fact, this field claims that our neural mechanisms of behavior are a byproduct of our biology. Some people have criticized this claim because they state that this negates all environmental influence. However, we can also state that we cannot negate the influence of nature in our thought processes. Now, when we look at behavior, we've talked about individuals that subscribe perhaps to the evolutionary psychology perspective, which claims that your behavior is a byproduct of an inheritance factor that you receive from your parents and your grandparents and so forth. And so we look at nature heavily through this particular subfield. Now, this subfield compares different species to understand evolution and genetics and the adaptiveness of behavior. And through this, we try to understand how it is that animal behavior in their natural environment would compare to human behaviors in our society. This makes use of ecology, which is a branch of biology that deals with relations of organisms to one another and to their physical surroundings, and as stated earlier, evolutionary psychology, which is an attempt to understand behavior through its evolutionary origins. Another thing of interest for comparative psychology would be behavioral genetics, and that is understanding the genetic influences on behavior. For example, there are individuals who have researched whether your genetics have anything to do with the type of drunk that you are. And a study back in 2013 claims to have found a gene, and that is HBR2, and they dubbed this gene as the drunk jerk gene. And that is because individuals who were the carriers of this gene were more likely to be a little bit more on the mean side when they were drunk than people who did not carry this specific gene. Individuals who did not carry this gene were more likely to be passive or emotional. And while some people may claim that this was a learned response, research from this study dictates or supports the notion that, in fact, there is a biological influence behind this in here. We've covered a significant amount of content. Please take the time now to review these 3 questions and answer them to the best of your ability. It is also a good idea to continue building up on whatever content you may have learned before. So even though we already left Module 1.1 and 1.2.3 and 4 behind, please continue using that as a platform to understand content in upcoming modules.